Introduction by J. Glenn Gray. What is Called Thinking is a course of university lectures. Martin Heidegger delivered these lectures to his students during the winter and summer semesters of 1951 and 1952 at the University of Freiburg. They were the last before his formal retirement from the university. They were also the first lectures he was permitted to give there since 1944, when he was drafted by the Nazis into the People's Militia, Volkssturm, and was afterwards forbidden to teach by the French occupying powers. What this long interruption in his teaching activity must have cost him is not difficult to guess, for Heidegger is above all else a teacher. It is no accident that nearly all his publications since Being in Time, in 1927, were first lectures or seminar discussions. For him, the spoken word is greatly superior to the written, as it was for Plato. In this book he named Socrates, a teacher, not an author, the purest thinker of the West. As his succinct remarks about teaching early in these lectures bear witness, Heidegger regards teaching as an exalted activity which has nothing to do with becoming a famous professor or an expert in one's field. Instead, he likens it to the master-apprentice relation of the medieval guilds, where the purpose of the teaching craft is to let learning occur. This can take place only when the teacher is more teachable than the apprentices, able to impart by his own example the proper relatedness to the subject matter being learned. In the present lectures, it is evident that Heidegger is first and foremost preoccupied with the students before him, only secondarily with the wider circle of readers who will necessarily miss the vital character and nuances of the spoken word. In order to aid these students in maintaining continuity in lectures delivered at weekly intervals, Heidegger provided in every case a summary of the preceding lecture, a summary which is also a transition to the new material. At his expressed wish, we have placed these Studienübergänge at the beginning of each lecture, rather than grouping them at the back of the two parts of the book, as in the German edition. Though Heidegger rarely summarizes exactly what he said in the previous week, this procedure does make for considerable repetition. Such repetition occurs naturally in every lecture course, and these lectures were not revised for publication, as a note on the flyleaf informs us. But for a man who puts as much emphasis as Heidegger on the way anything is said, and who reflects on what he himself thought a week earlier, the repetition of a thought is significant. The transitions also contribute to the informal nature of the lectures, with their frequent asides and polemical remarks, which the conventions of written prose scarcely allow. In these and other ways, Heidegger the teacher is revealed. In his intellectual development, this book proves to be something of a turning point. During the late 30s and into the 40s, Heidegger was deeply involved with the thought of Nietzsche. It seemed to him necessary to come to grips with Nietzsche's absolutizing of the will as a culmination of Western metaphysics. By the time of the lecture here translated, it is clear that Nietzsche's thinking has been absorbed, first found and then lost, as he puts it. The difficulty of first finding and then losing Nietzsche causes him to recommend to his students that they postpone reading Nietzsche for the time being and first study Aristotle for 10 to 15 years. In the second half of the present volume, accordingly, we hear nothing further of Nietzsche's doctrine of the will to power or eternal recurrence. To discover what thinking is, we are instead led back to the origins of Greek thinking before Aristotle. It is clear that the ideas which have preoccupied him in Germany's chaotic decades between 1930 and 1950 are gradually being replaced by the themes of the 50s and 60s. These themes are frequently suggested in the present volume, even adumbrated, but not really developed. The one most noticeable is the nature of language, which has come to hold the center of his attention till the present and has received its fullest treatment in his book Unterwegs der Sprache, 1959, which will later appear in this translation series. To be sure, Heidegger has long before this reflected on the mysterious nature of language in its relation to thinking and being. But in the present lectures, one can note progress towards the conception of language as that sphere in which man can dwell aright and make clear to himself who he is. Here, Heidegger is more directly concerned with the way language relates to thinking and its response to the call of thought. Later, he will make language itself the focus of what his reflections and meditations. In this sense, what is called thinking is a signpost on Heidegger's way. The other theme increasingly to capture his attention is the nature of modern science and technology. It will doubtless shock the American reader to learn that in these lectures that science does not think. Even when such a reader remembers that the term science for Europeans includes history, literature, and philosophy, as well as the natural sciences, he'll still be affronted. He has probably suspected that the later Heidegger is anti-science and mystical, and this assertion by Heidegger is likely to confirm his opinion. But if he continues to read with sufficient thoughtfulness, he will note that much later in this book that science does not think in the way that thinkers think. In a certain sense, then, Heidegger is deliberately trying to shock such a reader as he was with his students. No doubt this is an aspect of his pedagogical method, though his assertion has a more important purpose. Those who are acquainted with his later essays on science and technology will be hesitant to accept the impression that he is anti-science or that he is necessarily pessimistic about present developments. It certainly seems so, but things are seldom what they seem in this man's writings. If the most thought-provoking thing about our thought-provoking age is that we are still not thinking, it has always been thus since the early Greeks. As he makes clear in this volume, Heidegger is neither pessimistic nor optimistic about the times in which we live. It is only that the nature of our technological age requires thinking more than earlier ages, for modern man conceives himself prepared to take dominion over the earth, and his capabilities for good and ill are vastly augmented. Organized knowledge, that is, the natural and humanistic sciences, is not on a lower level than thinking, as Heidegger understands it. Moreover, the sciences are more and more determining the character of contemporary reality. They spring from an authentic source in our Western heritage, for techne was for the Greeks a species of knowledge, and in its own way a disclosure of truth and being. Its predominance in our time calls for another kind of response, namely thinking, which stems from a different source than techne, but also Greek. At all events, in the present work, Heidegger is not directly concerned with the nature of science, but with the nature of thinking, which he conceives to be quite another matter. What is it that Heidegger does call thinking? It is important to say, first of all, what he does not call thinking. Thinking is, in the first place, not what we call having an opinion or a notion. Second, it is not representing or having an idea, Vorstellung, about something or a state of affairs. This is an important negation for Heidegger, which he dealt with at greater length in Conversations on a Country Path about Thinking, in Discourse on Thinking, published by Harper Row in 1965. Third, thinking is not ratiocination, developing a chain of premises which lead to a valid conclusion. Lastly, it is not conceptual or systematic in the sense favored by the German idealistic tradition, the concept or Begriff believed by Hegel to be thinking par excellence. Heidegger is, however, not denying the importance of these conceptions of thinking. He is hardly a nothing but kind of philosopher. Opining, representing, reasoning, conceiving, all have their place and function. They are more useful and necessary in most respects than is thinking as he understands it. These accustomed ways of grasping thinking, as he remarks in his book, are so stubborn because they have their own truth. There is always a struggle to advance a new way of seeing things because customary ways and preconceptions about it stand in the way. The situation is similar to learning a foreign language. Forgetting our mother tongue is the chief difficulty. Furthermore, Heidegger makes no claim that thinking can produce knowledge as do the sciences, nor can it promote usable practical wisdom, solve any cosmic riddles, or endow us directly with the power to act. There is no salvation to be found in it. In all these ways, it is clearly inferior to the sciences and all these activities which commonly pass for thinking. Nevertheless, thinking in his sense does have its own importance and relevance. Heidegger is clearly working towards a theory of the independent role of a kind of thinking that is at once poetic and philosophic. Like many other continental thinkers today, he wants to insist on a new conception of philosophy as an autonomous inquiry. For Heidegger, thinking is a response on our part to a call which issues from the nature of things, from being itself. To be able to think does not wholly depend on our will and wish, though much does depend on whether we prepare ourselves to hear that call to think when it comes, and respond to it in the appropriate manner. Thinking is determined by that which is to be thought as well as by him who thinks. It involves not only man's receptivity to being, but also being's receptivity to man. The history and situation of man in a given age often covers up the nature of reality and renders it impossible to receive the message of being. Thinking is not so much an act as a way of living or dwelling, as we in America would put it, a way of life. It is a remembering who we are as human beings and where we belong. It is a gathering and focusing of our whole selves on what lies before us and a taking to heart and mind those particular things before us in order to discover in them their essential nature and truth. Learning how to think can obviously aid us in this discovery. Heidegger's conception of truth as the revealing of what is concealed, in distinction to the theory of truth as correctness or correspondence, is probably his most seminal thought in philosophy's main task, as he sees it. The nature of reality and of man is both hidden and revealed. It both appears and withdraws from view, not in turn, but concomitantly. Only the thinking that is truly involved, patient, and disciplined by long practice can come to know either the hidden or disclosed character of truth. The final lecture in this volume, which parallels the last chapter in Introduction to Metaphysics, brings out most clearly, more clearly in my judgment than did the earlier book, Heidegger's central intuitions about the nature of thinking. It represents his attempt to translate the famous saying of Parmenides about the relation of saying and thinking to being. What Heidegger is here suggesting is that thinking is a concrete seeing and saying of the way the world is. Man is an integral part of this world and can realize it by asking questions of it, profound and naive questions, and by waiting even a whole lifetime for the disclosures that may come. Thinking is unlike any other act insofar as it is an act at all. Thinking is a calling in more than one sense of that richly evocative word. Thinking defines the nature of being human, and the more thoughtless we are, the less human we are. Yet thinking is inherent to man, is as inherent in man as being in the world. Hence, learning to think is as much a discovery of our own nature as it is a discovery of the nature of being. Every doctrine of man's nature, as he tells us in these lectures, is at one and the same time a doctrine of being. And every doctrine of being is by the same token a doctrine of human nature. That is to say, the relatedness of man to being is so integral that inquiry into one involves the necessity of the other, too. This book closes with a question, appropriately, since the title and indeed most of the lectures are an extended question. To this question, no answer is given in the sense of a definition or description. Indeed, Heidegger teaches that none can be given. As we learn in the opening sentence, we come to know what thinking means when we ourselves try to think. To define thinking for someone else would be as hopeless as describing colors to the blind. Thinking is questioning, and putting ourselves in question as much as the cherished opinions and inherited doctrines we have long taken for granted. Each must learn to do it for himself. Heidegger, as teacher, demonstrates and encourages his students to follow suit. The result of such questioning is not negative or skeptical. Despite diversions and asides, the course of these lectures advances Heidegger's theme in such a way that we learn a good deal about how to question rightly. This intimate connection between thinking and questioning is central to everything Heidegger is trying to learn by these exercises in thinking. Putting in question is not primarily a method for him as it was for Descartes and for his teacher Husserl. At least it is not a method in the sense that one uses it as a preliminary to building up a body of doctrine after tearing down earlier systems. No. For Heidegger, questioning is a way or path of thinking each one must clear for himself with no certain predestination in mind. It must be likened to making a first path on skis through new fallen snow, or clearing a way for oneself through dense forest growth. Questioning and thinking are not a means to an end. They are self-justifying. To think is to be underway, a favorite word of critical importance to Heidegger. His general question remains constant, namely the relation of human being and other beings to being as such. But the way changes frequently, since he often gets into bypaths and dead ends. His persistence in holding to the question he has chosen to think about, as well as his flexibility and approach to it, are sources of admiration, even among the ranks of his detractors. Since thinking and questioning are so nearly synonymous, it is difficult for critics and historians of thought to classify and locate him in the tradition. In Germany, he is sometimes held to be a continuer of Hegel or Nietzsche. Often he is thought to be a modern follower of Parmenides or Heraclitus. Despite his great love for the Greeks and his familiarity with Western philosophical thought, I believe it is a fundamental mistake to read Heidegger as a follower of this or that previous thinker. He seems to me to have no basic dependence on any predecessors, not even his own previous thought. If his thinking is never carried on in disregard of the tradition, he is rarely satisfied with the conclusions of others, nor, after a time, with his own. Close students of his will realize how far he has come since being in time, however they may divide on the question of whether there has been a decisive turn since that early work. Today, at age 79, he starts every morning afresh, without any secure base in past systems of thought, and is still dissatisfied with what he himself has worked out. A future age may well consider his contribution to philosophy to be that of an initiator of new approaches and perspectives on our common inheritance, rather than any new content or doctrine. He seeks to press beyond systems and concepts, to live in the meta, as he here suggests was the simple and therefore inexhaustible significance of Greek thought, the one aspect of that thought seized upon by the Christian Middle Ages and carried over into modern thought. Fruitful as it has been, he believes to have reached an impasse today. The only way to go forward is to return to the origins and seek a new beginning. The advance Heidegger wishes to make on the basis of Greek thought is to learn to think non-conceptually and non-systematically, yet with rigor and strictness about the nature of being. By doing so, he hopes to avoid the subjectivity involved in separating human being and being, subject and object. He desires a thinking that is at once receptive to the sense, in the sense of a listening and attending to what things convey to us, and active in the sense that we respond to their call. Only when we are really immersed in what is to be thought can we reveal truly the nature of anything, no matter how commonplace it may be, and only then can we avoid our habitual ways of grasping it as it is for us, i.e., subjectively. The call of thought is thus the call to be attentive to things as they are, to let them be as they are, and to think them and ourselves together. This is, of course, difficult, and all the more so as Heidegger believes in this man-centered age of ours. It is an age in which we consider it quite in order that we cannot at all follow the thought processes of modern theoretical physics, but to learn the thinking of thinkers is essentially more difficult, not because that thinking is still more involved, but because it is simple. Nevertheless, if we persist in attempting to master the handicraft of thinking, it is not impossible. Heidegger is persuaded that man is naturally inclined to think, and being desires to be thought truly. To offer translation of a Heideggerian work requires a measure of courage, perhaps better named rashness. The reasons are clearly stated in the present volume. A translation is necessarily an interpretation, according to him, and also every genuine thinking is ambiguous in its very nature. Multiplicity of meanings is the element in which thought must move in order to be strict thought, he tells his students. Or, again, to move within language is like moving on the billowing waves of an ocean. Heidegger reveals in the ambiguity of the German language and in the multiple meanings of the word he chooses. He thinks poetically, all the more the older he becomes. Translators can never be sure in a given case which of these meanings Heidegger wishes to predominate. One can, of course, use two or more English words for a single German term, and this we have frequently done. It gradually becomes clear to a translator, however, that Heidegger rarely abandons the idiomatic sense of a German word, no matter how technical or terminological its overtones. He has great respect for the common idiom, though none at all for the commonness of thoughtless usage. Most of his words retain as much as possible of their root meanings in their Greek, Latin, or Old German origins. Hence, we have tried to stick to Anglo-Saxon equivalents where we could, and to keep uppermost the simple, non-technical sense of what he is trying to say. This way, it is easier for the philosophically sophisticated reader to provide the contemporary technical connotations of these words, and for the layman in philosophy not to miss the essential message of this book. Though Heidegger was extremely helpful in answering my question about the meaning of a term, a sentence, or a whole passage, Fred Weick and I would not claim that we have caught the intended emphasis in every case. This may well be the first Heidegger translation in English to be worked out in close cooperation with the author, but it does not pretend to be an authorized translation. Martin Heidegger does not know English well enough for that. However, we do believe that it is as close to the author's intentions as our own limitations in understanding and the requirements of readable English allow. If it remains, nonetheless, an interpretation, we trust that it is one which is faithful to the spirit and substance of the original.